Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Avi Havivi's weekly Siddur class.
We're going to finish up, God willing, this week and next week with the so-called partial theists, or I saw another term in the book we're using, a term I looked, which was naturalistic theology, something like that, which means, theology, ideas about God, but looked at really through a natural or humanistic lens. It's called naturalistic theology, but we could also call it, I think, humanistic theology. So we looked at, and then after the break, sometime we'll resume, God willing, sometime in the Omer. Then we're going to go on to other modern streams of thought. We're going to look at something called process theology and neo-Hasidic thinkers, contemporary thinkers, all contemporary people. The three, air quotes, the three moderns that we've been looking at, are all from did their writings 20 to 80 years ago. Okay, so we did Milton Steinberg, we did Harold Schulweis, and now we're doing Shiva Del Chaim. I think he's still alive. Harold Kushner, okay, for 2 weeks, and his view of quote unquote limited theology, right? Naturalistic theology. And again, at the end of all this, you may end up saying, the end of all this, meaning the end of next week, you may end up saying, hey man, we read three people who all said kind of the same thing. And that was redundant. They all have slightly different angles, but they are all saying God exists, God is real, we can't actually know anything about God, and what God does, this is the key, what God does is what God does in the world is limited, and so we can't ask God to be a big invisible magician in the sky, and we need to focus on our reaction to the world and to God, right? What Schulweis called predicate theology, right? Meaning it's about godliness and it's not about God, all right? So God exists, but that's not our focus. Our focus is on godliness, which means what do human beings do that is godly? And of course, this is where he's a disciple of Kaplan, because Kaplan would have said the same thing, Mordechai Kaplan, except Kaplan would have said, and God doesn't exist, right? And there are things that human beings do, our highest spiritual and moral aspirations that we refer to as godly. It's a term that we make up, whereas Schulweis would say, no, they actually are a reflection of the actual divine. Okay, so Kushner starts out sort of where Maimonides starts out. In some sense, this starts out with a traditional theology. God is not a thing, okay? Which he's also going to go on to say God is not a person, okay? All discussion at the bottom of the page, all discussion of human thing-oriented language about God is bound to be metaphorical and misleading if taken literally. Does God hear prayers and cries? Oh, and then I cut off the rest. He said, hearing means, there are sound waves and eardrums that vibrate, and one person made a sound and another person, and that's what we mean by hearing, okay? So God obviously doesn't hear in that sense, top of 190. If God is not a thing, it goes without saying that God is not a person, not even a super person. He does not do what people do, only better. God is a totally different order of reality than we humans are, not just bigger, better, or further away, but completely different. So what that means, and this kind of goes back to Maimonides, but in some sense it goes further than Maimonides, right? Maimonides says we all have intelligence. That's a little bit of godliness. And our goal is to use our intelligence to fully grasp that which is pure intelligence. And here's where Kushner would say, no. You're still using a human category to say that God is something like that human category. It's just an infinite version of that human category. Now, I'll say it more Kabbalistically. We say humans have a soul, okay, but God is the soul of the universe, and there's some goal for our soul to connect to God's soul as much as possible. Let's just say Rav Kook would say that. Kushner, I think, would say no, because then you're making the mistake of saying, oh, you are God is like an aspect of me, aspect, instead of intellect, which is what Rambam said, you call it soul, whatever that means. Okay. And then when we're in California in the 21st century, we'd say energy. Okay. Instead of soul, but you're still saying God is like an aspect of humans. God is just an infinite version of that aspect of humans. I mean, Kushner is actually, in some sense, taking Rambam really, really seriously, right? And saying, no, God, whatever God is an N of one. So there's nothing in our human experience that can grasp anything like what God is. Totally different order of reality. Yet so much of the confusion, so many of the misunderstandings about God stem from our habit of thinking of God as a pious Superman, right? This is sort of traditional theology, traditional rabbinic theology, subject to no limitation, not even the laws of nature. So if God can split the Red Sea, then we're left saying, why did God do that? How could God let that happen? How could God let the Holocaust happen? How could God let a child die? Right? You probably know that, some of this emerges from Kushner's own experience of having a child die. Okay. And that sort of led to him writing his book, Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People? Perhaps the greatest step toward a mature understanding of God is the realization that God doesn't do things the way a person does them. God does not cause things to happen in the world. Okay. It would be very pleasant to believe in a God who really did make things happen by the same rational and physical processes that we employ. So the doctor heals someone, right? Gives it antibiotics to beat back the bacteria. It would be very comforting to believe that if I pray to God the right way and God listens to my prayer, God will beat back the bacteria and the person. It would be pleasant to believe that. Remember what Schulweis said that we read last week in a very trenchant way, which is the flip side of that, is then if the person isn't healed, then we're left having to say something like, oh, God has a plan that we don't understand. He made fun of it by calling it, mind reading of the inscrutable God. We assume that God is thinking something. I just don't understand what God is thinking because I'm limited. All right. So the positive aspect is, it would be nice to believe that God would decide, I am going to beat back the bacteria because I'm going to listen to the prayers of a person, or a God who punished us for what we did wrong and protected us from harm if we deserved protection. God is standing at that traffic intersection. Yep. Making sure that the drunk driver doesn't hurt anyone. But there is so much evidence from real experience contradicting this kind of belief that its proponent would have to spend all his time defending and apologizing for it. Okay? There's so many deaths in the world that are unfair that if you believed in a God who could cause these things to change differently, you would end up spending all your time defending and apologizing God. Does everyone follow that argument? Now, I just want to say, the sages 2,000 years ago realized that, and that is why they evolved and adopted the idea of Olam Haba, the world to come, right? They said there is this place and time that is beyond our place and time where the accounting gets rectified. So they understood this problem, right? Everyone, as I said last week, every Jew understood this, every thoughtful Jew understood this problem since the book of Job. Okay. And again, the book of Job echoes, Sumerian Mesopotamian literature from 2000 BCE, from 1500 years before, right? So in other words, people have understood this challenge for 4,000 years. If there's a God who runs everything and who espouses and lives by principles of justice, how come there are things that happen in the world that seem cruel and unfair that are not stopped by God? All right? So not a new problem, not a new philosophical question. It's been around for at least 4,000 years, okay? And he's just echoing that. He's just saying, so there's a lot of Jobs around when you look around, all right? So you end up spending all your time making up, why did God allow the Holocaust to happen? Why did God save the people? All these stories. It was a miracle. I was saved in this tank or whatever, or the missile fell. If I would have been there 5 seconds before, right? And those stories. Now I'm going to be. I don't mean to tempt the ayin hara, okay, by saying what I'm saying, but all those stories are great and inspiring. And what about the people who didn't move 5 seconds before? There are lots of them, right? Were they unworthy? So if God is not a person or a thing, or I'm going to add now, an intellect or a soul, if God has neither shape nor form and does not take up space, what is God? There's probably no completely accurate word in our language for the reasons we have already used. In order not to mislead, we would need a word used only for God, not for any tangible earthbound object. So if I have a soul, then I can't say that God is a soul. Okay? If I have an intellect, then I can't say God is an intellect. I can't say that, like some amoeba, I have something within me which is a snipped off little piece of God. I can't say that, because then essentially God is made up of the same stuff as some part of human. And if God is fundamentally unlike any other category, I can't say that. I need to have a new word, a different word. That's not soul or intellect or demut or tselem or energy. And he says, we did make up a word like that. That word is God, okay? Which means that which is an N of one. But now he says, but there are words that point in the right direction. God is something like a force, a power, a process, a quality of relation. By the way, notice he capitalizes force, power, and process. And if we said to him, do you mind if we add the words intellect, soul, and energy capitalized? I'm sure Kushner would say, sure, go ahead, knock yourself out, right? Add those to the list. But remember the something like, okay? God is the name we attach. This is where he's Kaplanian, next sentence. God is the name we attach to the fact that we find certain things possible and meaningful in the world and in our lives, and the fact that we find ourselves stirred to move in the direction of realizing these possibilities, right? Kaplan would agree with this statement. God is the name that we attach to certain human possibilities and striving. Again, sorry to beat a dead horse. Kaplan would just say it's a fiction, and Kushner would say, no, it's not a fiction. It's a reality that we can't fully understand because it's fundamentally unlike any other reality that we call God the force behind our growing and learning, our curiosity to discover, and our impulse to share and to help. I don't know that sentence added, but I want to read the sentence before, because that's kind of the point. God, near the bottom of that page 190. I'm just going to read it again. God is the name we attach to the fact that we find certain things possible and meaningful in the world and in our lives. In other words, we humans, on our human level, find certain things possible and meaningful. And that might be things that humans do. It might be things that humans understand, which might mean, like nature and science. Okay. So there are things that humans do and understand. So the fact that we find certain things possible and meaningful in the world and in our lives, and the fact that we find ourselves stirred to move in the direction of realizing these possibilities, right? What Schulweis would call predicate theology, right? We feel moved to be godly. And what Rabbi Yitz Greenberg called our partnership with God in the covenant. If you remember way back, Yitz Greenberg said, what is our partnership with God in the covenant? Well, besides the fact that it's trying to eradicate disease and hunger by doing acts of kindness, beneficence, it's also working in the world organizations to beat back disease and hunger. It's also the scientists who are discovering strategies to beat back disease. All of those things are our examples that embody our partnership in the covenant with God. Again, for Yitz Greenberg, I just want to remind you, because I'm trying to weave all these things together and show you how these lines of thinking are similar or different. For Yitz Greenberg, it's because God in phase one, when we were children, chose to react, which means I'm going to make you sick. I'm going to heal you. I'm going to split the Red Sea. But by phase 3, God has said, sorry, I'm stepping back here. You're the full adult, and it's all in your hands, you human being. I'm not going to intervene in it. If you choose to run out in the street, I'm not going to stop you from running out in the street. That's his analogy. The name God stands for all those qualities in the world and in ourselves which our religious traditions label as divine. That is, as comprising full human spiritual development, fashioning humanity into what we are at our best and most fully real. And again, here is where I think you could really overlay this statement. Oh, do people still have me? Larry Herman says he lost me. Michael, you still got me? Okay. All right. Larry, it's just you. But he lost me, so he can't hear me say that. Okay. I'm going to read that sentence again. Okay. Because again, this is a sentence that could have been in Schulweis or in Kaplan. And this is where they're all in the same boat, except Kaplan is the kofar, the denier of God's existence. The name God stands for all those qualities in the world and in ourselves, which our religious tradition labels as divine, that is, as comprising full human spiritual development, fashioning humanity into what we are at our best and most fully real. If truth, justice, mercy, generosity, love are among the things we need to be genuine human beings, to be, in the biblical phrase, people in God's image, then the name God stands for the existence of these qualities in the world and the existence of a corresponding impulse toward them in every human soul. The statement, for example, that God is just or that God demands justice of humans doesn't really tell us anything about a being named God, but it does tell us that justice is one of the qualities human beings need to be fully and satisfyingly human. Okay, a couple of sentences down. Belief in God is not so much a statement about somebody living in heaven as it is an affirmation of the world and the human beings who inhabit it, what they are and what they are capable of becoming. Belief in God means believing that the universe has order and direction, that it encourages human goodness and moral growth, and that the impulse each of us feels to be a good person is a reflection of the purposefulness existing in the cosmos at large, which is another way of saying Genesis chapter 1, right? Creation is the creation, which is a theological, poetic term, which means the universe is orderly and good, okay? So when we are striving to live in a way that grasps and appreciates the orderliness of it, and that becoming more good is in keeping with that, that is belief in God. Bereshit chapter 1 says it in mythic terms, and he is saying it here in simple philosophic. Okay? Second part of what I'm going to read, I'm going to leave for next week, and that is, okay, so what do we say when bad things happen, and why do we pray? Meaning, okay, I got this idea, so then what is our response when evil happens, evil or suffering, right? And if God does not, in air quotes, hear our prayers and decide whether or not to respond, the traditional Jewish view. God heard your prayers. God just decided that the answer is no. That would be a traditional rabbinic view, okay? But obviously in this framework, that's not an acceptable answer. So we're going to get to how Kushner addresses that, and we're going to leave that for next, okay? But this is his statement about kind of what God is. He doesn't use godliness. He doesn't say predicate theology, but I think he is saying essentially the same thing as Schulweis. And I think they are both saying we believe in the godliness of human fulfillment like Kaplan does, except he believes God is a fiction and we don't believe God is a fiction. We just believe God is something that is not graspable in human terms, is a reality that is not graspable in human terms. And by the way, even using the word reality, even that's limited, because reality means like, I don't know, is the phone there or not? If it's there, then it's a reality. If it's not there, but I'm thinking of it, it's a reality in my brain because of cells and chemicals that are having an image of a phone. So, but either way, it's a reality. And he's saying God is not a reality like that, because either one of those is still physical, material, human-based categories. By the way, if you can find it online on Safaria, it's easy enough to find an English translation. Maimonides' Code of Human Law, the whole first division is about belief, and chapter 1, book 1, chapter 1, easily readable in English, and it basically says God is fundamentally unlike any category that humans are capable of conceiving, of which humans are capable of conceiving. Anything we can say about God is only negative. We cannot say anything positive. So if reality means either the phone is here or it's not, or it cells and chemicals in my brain thinking of the memory of a phone, if that's what reality is, then you can't say God is reality, right? Because God is not like the cells and chemicals in my brain, and God is not like a phone. So all we can say of God is what God is not. There's nothing that we are able to say. There's nothing accurate that we are able to conceive about God's being or essence, which leaves a lot of people feeling cold. It's a cold universe, because whatever happened to he got the whole world in his hands. I can't remember if that's on my Pesach song sheets or not. We have if I had a hammer and blowing in the wind, and I don't remember if he got the whole world in his hands or not. But whatever happened to that, right? God is cradling me. This is something very appealing about, Jesus is my friend, and I talk to Jesus, right? There's something or Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, or Rebbe Nachman, going out to the forest and screaming and crying and talking to God in Yiddish, in your language, because God hears what you're saying. Yeah. It's always a danger in misquoting. Rambam would be revolted by the idea of, I think Rambam would be revolted by the idea of Rebbe Nachman going out into the woods and crying and screaming to God. He would just think, how ridiculous. You think God can only hear you if you scream and cry? If you think thoughts, God doesn't hear you, right? What a primitive display of religiosity is what Rambam would say, right? Because God is beyond all categories. Okay, sorry, I yammered a lot. Let's allow a few minutes, maybe 4 to 5 minutes for reaction, comment. There was a hand up. Someone had a hand. Michael, unmute, please.
It was a mistake, but I would say, what would he think of the narrow bridge, and all these things,
Correct. But by the way, Hasidism is not a reaction against Rambam. Mysticism partly is a reaction. Zohar is partly a reaction against Rambam, right? I'll use what all the scholar books say, right? Zohar, medieval Jewish mysticism is about the re-mythologization of Judaism in the face of cold, abstract, intellectual, and dry Jewish philosophy that no regular person is able to grasp. Okay. It's a re-mythologization, right? Or a re-enchantment. And then, this is the party line in all the books, Judaism again in Eastern Europe became very intellectual. It was all about Talmudic learning, and became devoid of what we contemporary Americans would call soul. I don't mean the human soul. I mean, it lacked soul. Okay. And it was all, it was all Bach and no jazz. All right. And then Hasidism brought back jazz. It brought back life and soul, right? That anyone was able to do, because any idiot, even without piano lessons, can plunk on the piano and make music. Doesn't mean it's good music or elevated music or in a key or anything like that. But anyone can do that. So anyone can go out in the forest and talk Yiddish to God, right? So it's an attempt to allow common people to re-experience the divine instead of having it be something for the elite, whether it's the Talmudic learning of the 17th and 18th and 19th century, or whether it's the philosophy of the medieval philosophers. Both of them are for an elite. They're not something that everyone is able to do. This is the party line of why Jewish mysticism is a pushback against philosophy, or why Hasidism is a pushback against the yeshiva, the party line. Okay. Some people disagree with that, but that's kind of what a lot of scholars say. Okay, other thoughts, questions, comments?
Why has Yitz Greenberg, in your opinion, moved more toward man's, I guess, in a way, more toward Schulweis and Kushner as opposed to...
That I have an answer to, because his first area of, and he talks about this in his biography, because his first area of serious study, I think maybe in the early 60s, was the Shoah, the Holocaust. So whereas somehow after the destruction of the first temple, there is a Jeremiah and an Ezekiel who said, God allowed this to happen because we were worshiping idols. And after the destruction of the second temple, there were rabbis, sages, who said, God allowed this to happen because of baseless hatred among Jews. There were thinkers, Yitz Greenberg among them, who said, because of the enormity of the Holocaust, a million children killed, a million children, right? I think this is out of 6 million Jews, a million children murdered. Don't say died and don't say exterminated. Okay. That is a bad historical thing of such enormity. I cannot conceive of a theology. I cannot conceive of or accept a theology in which God allowed that to happen, or we can interpret that as an instrument of God's will in history. Can't do that. Therefore, God didn't do that. Therefore, God wasn't involved. That was human beings doing it to other human beings without God's involvement. Therefore, if I'm a believer in God, she is, Yitz Greenberg, I've got to explain, so where was God? And why did God not intervene? Yitz Greenberg's, by the way, so Schulweis and Kushner, I think, would say, because God doesn't do that. Not how God acts in the world. Yitz, may he live long, Shibadel Chaim. Yitz would say, because God doesn't do that anymore. I believe that God did that in Egypt, but I don't believe God does that anymore. I believe God has voluntarily chosen the path of Tzimtzum. God has said, I will recuse myself from intervention in human things. I taught them. I gave instructions. It's up to them now. It's up to you guys. Got you guys and gals and people. You do it now. I don't do that anymore. Now, of course, you'd probably say, Kushner and Schulweis, I'm guessing, would probably say, well, God didn't do that in Egypt either. That's just our framing myth, right? I don't think they would say God used to do that, but because if they're talking about this is or is not the essence of God, then it's still a Maimonidean view of this was always the essence of God. Not that God changes, yeah? And whereas Yitz would say, no, God changed. Yeah, God changes how God interacts with the world. Stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. Stage 1, God does everything. Big parents. Stage 2, partnership with the rabbis. Stage 3, I'm stepping back. Okay. I think that would be the answer. So it emerges from his reaction to the Holocaust. And again, I think the two people we've just read would say, because God never acted that way. That's how the Holocaust happened, because God never really intervened. Kaplan would say, because there is no God. Okay. The sages would say, Chazal, traditional sages of the Talmud would say, don't worry, there's Olam Haba. Okay. Which is more real even than this world. And Yitz Greenberg would say, because God has changed what God's MO is. God's allowed to do that. God is God. Part of the plan. I'm going to be again, his model is like a parent. I'm going to be super involved and going to prevent you from running into the street when you're 4 years old. But when you're 34 years old, I don't prevent you from running into the street. You people want to blow up each other's energy sources? Gesundheit. Hate. Okay. It's up to you. Bernie?
Yeah, but and speaking to Michael Birnbaum, Yitz Greenberg was one of the 3 people that the State Department sent to Europe to decide what should be in the Holocaust Museum, and the other was Elie Wiesel. And the reason Michael became the first research director is that Yitz Greenberg wouldn't leave New York, and Elie Wiesel was busy, and he thought it was a nice thing. So he was obviously interested in the Holocaust.
Okay. I have to... I wish I could snip that out of the recording, because you're saying our good friend, it was the third choice is what you're saying. Okay.
No. He said, can you hear me? No,
yeah,
you can't.
Yes, we hear you.
Yeah, he said it was just a matter which one of you want to do it.
I got it.
And it worked out for him because it changes.
We had three equally what you meant was we had three equally great finalists, and we were fortunate that one of the three said yes.
Yeah, they didn't, they were all imminent or they wouldn't know. That's true.
We're going to wrap it up right there. Okay. Have a good week. Be Torah. Kosher your homes. God willing, we'll meet next Tuesday. We'll wrap up Kushner. We'll wrap up this line of thinking so that later on in the spring we'll move on to something else.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.